What if I told you that one of the most dangerous stories in American history was hidden in plain sight, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too believable to be allowed to survive? In 1849, a claim emerged from the heart of plantation society that should have shattered everything people thought they knew about power, race, faith, and truth. A plantation master's wife gave birth to twins. That alone raised whispers. But what followed turned whispers into fear. She claimed the children were not conceived through any human act. She claimed it was divine conception. In a time when society was ruled by rigid hierarchy, this story was not just shocking, it was lethal. Because the unspoken truth beneath it threatened to expose something far more dangerous than scandal. It threatened the system itself. This was an era where truth did not belong to everyone. It belonged to those with power. And when truth became inconvenient, it was buried, rewritten, or dressed up as something sacred. Religion was not just belief back then. It was protection. It was authority. It was the final word that silenced questions before they could become accusations. But here's what makes this story so unsettling. People around her knew. They had to. Rumors moved faster than records. Eyes saw what mouths could never repeat. And yet instead of outrage, the official explanation was accepted. Not because it made sense, but because the alternative was unthinkable. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is a historical controversy that was deliberately pushed into the shadows. Documents faded, testimonies vanished, and the voices that mattered most were never allowed to speak at all. In this video you are going to learn how a single claim from 1849 reveals the mechanics of power, silence, and control. You will see how faith was used to erase accountability, how society chose comfort over truth, and how the lives of the powerless were sacrificed to protect the image of the powerful. This story matters because it shows you how history is not just written by winners, it is edited by fear. It explains why certain truths never make it into textbooks, and why some stories survive only as whispers, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. By the end of this video you won't just understand what happened, you'll understand why it had to be hidden. And once you see it, you'll never look at official history the same way again. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just about the past, it's about how truth is controlled, even today. Before we talk about the woman, the children, or the claim itself, we have to understand the world that surrounded them. In 1849, society was not built on equality or shared truth. It was built on rank, on ownership, on fear. Power decided what was real, and silence decided what survived. Plantation life was not just an economic system, it was a complete social order. At the top stood the white landowner, supported by law, church, and custom. Beneath him was his family, whose image had to remain pure at all costs. Their honor was treated as sacred. Their reputation was protected like property. And beneath them, at the very bottom, were enslaved people who were denied even the right to their own voice. Race defined reality. A white person's word carried unquestioned authority. A black person's word, no matter how truthful, carried no weight at all. Even evidence could be ignored if it threatened the structure that held power in place. This imbalance was not accidental. It was enforced daily, through violence, punishment, and fear. Religion played a powerful role in this system. Faith was not just spiritual guidance, it was social armor. Plantation owners often presented themselves as moral leaders, chosen and blessed. The church reinforced obedience, teaching that hierarchy was natural and divinely approved. Questioning authority was framed as questioning God himself. Before we talk about the claim of divine conception, it's important to see why such a claim could even function as protection. In a society where religion outranked reason, invoking God ended conversations. It closed investigations. It redirected suspicion away from human action and toward mystery. And mystery was safer than truth. Silence was expected from those without power. Enslaved people were trained to survive by not speaking, to see everything and say nothing. Any accusation, even implied, could lead to punishment or death. So truth existed only in glances, pauses, and unspoken understanding. Meanwhile, those with power benefited from collective denial. Neighbors knew better than to ask questions. Doctors knew better than to record certain details. Clergy knew better than to challenge wealthy patrons. The system depended on cooperation, not honesty. Before we talk about consequences, we must recognize that this imbalance made accountability impossible. The same act meant different things depending on who committed it. What would destroy one life could be erased for another. Law did not protect everyone equally. Morality was flexible when status demanded it. Plantation hierarchy shaped not only behavior, but memory. What was recorded was filtered. What was remembered was curated. And what threatened the structure was buried under layers of justification, scripture, and silence. This is why truth did not stand a chance on its own. It needed permission. And permission was controlled by those who had the most to lose. In Southern society, her role was carefully defined long before any scandal could exist. She was expected to represent purity, restraint, and moral order. Her identity was not just personal, it was symbolic. She stood as proof that the system worked, that hierarchy was righteous, and that those at the top were morally superior to those beneath them. A plantation master's wife was seen as the keeper of virtue. She was expected to be gentle, faithful, and controlled. Her body, her behavior, and even her thoughts were assumed to be disciplined. She was not allowed complexity. She was not allowed contradiction. Any deviation threatened the image that held the household together. Her public behavior mattered more than truth. She attended church, she hosted guests, she oversaw the home. She embodied respectability. This image reassured the community that the social order was intact. If she appeared flawless, the system appeared justified. Purity was not just a personal expectation, it was political. Her perceived innocence helped excuse the brutality of the plantation itself. If the woman at the center was virtuous, then the power surrounding her must also be virtuous. Her image softened the violence that made her lifestyle possible. Obedience was equally important. She was expected to submit to her husband, while also reinforcing his authority. She was not meant to challenge him publicly, or create instability. Her silence was part of her duty. Even when suffering, she was expected to endure quietly. Moral authority was her greatest asset. She was trusted in matters of faith and family. Her word carried weight, especially among other women. Children were taught to see her as an example. Enslaved people were expected to obey her as a moral superior, not just a social one. Because of this, her reputation was untouchable. If her purity were questioned, the damage would spread outward. It would cast doubt on her husband. It would invite scrutiny into the household. It would disrupt the illusion of control. Southern society feared scandal more than injustice. A single accusation could unravel years of careful presentation. So protection became a collective effort. Family members defended her. Community leaders avoided questions. Religious figures reframed narratives. Her body was not treated as evidence. It was treated as a symbol that had to remain intact. Any explanation, no matter how improbable, was preferable to admitting moral failure within the ruling class. Truth was negotiable. Image was not. This is why extraordinary claims could survive. They preserved order. They redirected blame away from power and into mystery. And mystery, unlike truth, did not demand accountability. In that world, protecting her reputation meant protecting the system itself, and the system would sacrifice anything to survive. Enslaved men existed in a world where the law did not recognize them as full human beings. Before we talk about any accusation or claim, it is important to understand that their legal status erased their voice from the start. They were property under the law, not witnesses, not equals, and not people whose truth carried weight. They could not testify against white citizens in most Southern courts. Their words were dismissed before they were spoken. Even when evidence existed, it rarely mattered. The system was designed to protect those in power, not to uncover truth. Justice moved in only one direction. Socially, enslaved men were viewed through a lens of fear and control. They were portrayed as dangerous, impulsive, and morally inferior. These stereotypes were used to justify constant surveillance and violence. Any suggestion of intimacy, consent, or complexity was immediately reframed as threat or crime. An accusation involving a white woman was especially deadly. History shows that even unproven claims led to brutal punishment. Torture, public execution, or quiet disappearance were common outcomes. The accusation itself was treated as proof. Because of this, accusations could never work in their favor. Denial was interpreted as guilt. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Compliance was interpreted as guilt. There was no correct response because the outcome was decided in advance. The enslaved man's body did not belong to him. It was controlled, punished, and exploited at will. His labor, movement, and relationships were regulated. His inner life was irrelevant to the law. His pain was not recognized. Silence in this system was not a personal choice. It was enforced through terror. Speaking risked death. Being noticed risked death. Existing in the wrong place risked death. Survival required invisibility. Even rumors were dangerous. A look held too long. A presence noticed too often. A coincidence misinterpreted. Any of these could trigger violence. So silence became a survival strategy imposed by force. Religion and law worked together to maintain this silence. Enslaved men were taught obedience as virtue. Resistance was framed as sin. Endurance was framed as destiny. These messages reinforced the idea that suffering was natural and inevitable. When powerful families needed a story to protect themselves, enslaved men were convenient sacrifices. They could be blamed without defense. They could be punished without record. They could be erased without consequence. This is why historical records often feel incomplete. Voices are missing because they were never allowed to speak. What remains is not the full truth, but the version that power preserved. Rumors did not travel loudly in plantation society. They moved in whispers, glances, and pauses that lingered too long. Before anyone spoke openly, people sensed when something was wrong. A sudden change in routine. A door closed more often than before. A household that felt tense instead of orderly. These small shifts were noticed even if they were never named. Plantations functioned on observation. Enslaved people saw everything. Neighbors noticed patterns. Visitors read silence as information. Truth did not need to be announced to be felt. It simply hovered beneath the surface, growing heavier with time. The danger was never just the truth itself. It was what the truth would expose. If a forbidden reality came into the open, it would collapse the carefully maintained hierarchy. Power depended on the illusion of moral order. Once that illusion cracked, everything beneath it became unstable. This is why rumors were so feared. They did not need proof to cause damage. A question alone could be destructive. A suggestion could unravel reputations built over generations. And once a story began to circulate, it could not be fully controlled. Whispers moved between kitchens, fields, and nearby estates. They crossed boundaries that laws tried to enforce. People compared timelines. They noticed physical details. They remembered who was present and who was suddenly removed. Each fragment added weight to what could not be said directly. The arrival of twins made silence far more difficult. One child might be explained away. Illness, coincidence, or divine will could be used as cover. But two children arriving at the same time invited scrutiny. Twins demanded explanation. They forced people to look closer. Twins also carried symbolic weight. In many cultures they were seen as extraordinary, sometimes even unsettling. They drew attention by their very existence. Their similarity raised questions about origin, lineage, and inheritance. Questions that were dangerous in a society built on racial separation. Physical resemblance could not be ignored forever. Skin tone, facial features, and hair texture were observed carefully. People compared the children to others on the plantation. These comparisons happened silently, but they happened constantly. The more impossible the official explanation sounded, the more curiosity grew. Declaring something divine did not end questioning. It often intensified it. Faith could quiet some voices, but it could not erase human perception. Every additional witness increased risk. Midwives, servants, visitors. Each person carried a piece of the truth, even if they never spoke it aloud. And the more people who knew, the harder it became to maintain a single story. This is how pressure builds in silence. Not through confrontation, but through accumulation. The truth does not rush forward. It waits. And in situations like this, twins were not just children. They were undeniable evidence that something had gone terribly wrong. Before we talk about the story itself, it's important to understand why religion became the safest explanation available. In a society built on rigid rules, faith was one of the few forces powerful enough to override logic. Religion offered language that could not be questioned without risk. To doubt a religious claim was to risk being seen as immoral, disloyal, or dangerous. Faith was not only a personal belief system, it was a public shield. It allowed those in power to frame events in a way that demanded acceptance instead of investigation. Once something was labeled as divine, it was removed from ordinary scrutiny. Curiosity could be dismissed as blasphemy. Questions could be silenced by fear. Religious authority carried immense weight in plantation society. Churches reinforced social order. Sermons emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and submission as moral duties. These teachings made it easier to accept explanations that preserved power, even when they defied reason. Using religion as an explanation was not about spirituality. It was about control. Declaring a miraculous event redirected attention away from human actions and toward divine mystery. It shifted responsibility upward, where no one could challenge it. This protected reputations and preserved the existing structure. Faith also provided emotional comfort. For those who sensed the truth but feared its implications, a religious explanation offered relief. Believing in a miracle was easier than confronting a reality that would expose violence, hypocrisy, and injustice. Acceptance became a form of self-protection. Society was trained to accept impossible stories if the alternative threatened stability. The truth in this case would have revealed a collapse of moral authority at the top. It would have exposed how deeply the system contradicted its own values. That kind of truth was more dangerous than any lie. Religious language made the story untouchable. Words like divine, God's will, and miracle ended conversations. They closed doors before questions could form. Anyone who pushed back risked social exile, or worse. This is how faith was weaponized. Not through belief, but through fear. The fear of standing alone. The fear of being labeled sinful. The fear of being labeled sinful. The fear of challenging the order that controlled livelihoods and lives. People learned quickly which truths were safe and which were forbidden. Forbidden truths were not debated. They were buried. And religion provided the soil. Even those who did not fully believe the explanation often repeated it. Silence and repetition worked together. Saying the words out loud made them feel real. Over time, the impossible story became the official one, simply because it was safer to accept. This pattern reveals something uncomfortable about society at the time. Truth was not determined by evidence. It was determined by power. And when faith served power, it became a tool to erase realities that could not be allowed to exist. Before we talk about the personal scandal, it's necessary to understand what was truly at stake. This was not only about reputation or morality, it was about protecting white supremacy as a system. The plantation was not just a home. It was property, power, and proof of dominance. Any threat to that structure had to be contained immediately. White supremacy depended on clear boundaries. Who held power? Who obeyed? Who owned? Who was owned? If those lines blurred, the entire system weakened. Acknowledging forbidden intimacy would have exposed how fragile the hierarchy really was. It would have shown that control was not absolute. Property was central to this order. Enslaved people were legally classified as assets. Land, labor, and lineage were tightly linked. If the truth disrupted ownership claims or raised questions about lineage, it could trigger legal chaos. Inheritance, authority, and control would all come into question. The husband's authority had to remain intact. He was not just a man, he was the face of order on the plantation. His power rested on the belief that he controlled both his household and the people he enslaved. Any suggestion that this control had failed would weaken his standing among peers. Male authority was performative. It required constant reinforcement. Silence protected that image. Accepting a divine explanation preserved his role as master husband and moral leader. Questioning it would imply weakness, loss of control, or humiliation. Social collapse was a real fear. Plantations operated on shared denial. Neighbors relied on each other to uphold the same lies. If one truth surfaced, others could follow. This mutual silence maintained stability, even when it was built on violence and hypocrisy. Legal consequences were equally dangerous. Courts were not designed to challenge white power, but scandal could still create complications. Laws surrounding inheritance, legitimacy, and ownership could be triggered by public controversy. Avoidance was safer than confrontation. White supremacy also relied on moral narratives. Plantation owners framed themselves as civilizers, protectors, and spiritual leaders. Any exposure of forbidden behavior would shatter that illusion. Religion and silence repaired what truth would destroy. Community complicity mattered. Ministers, neighbors, and local officials all played a role. By accepting the explanation, they preserved their own positions. Challenging it would mean challenging the system that benefited them. What mattered most was continuity. Crops needed harvesting. Labor needed enforcing. Authority needed obedience. Anything that interrupted this rhythm was treated as a threat, not a problem to be solved. This is how power protects itself. Not through honesty, but through preservation. The truth was dangerous because it revealed the system's weakness, and so it was buried beneath silence, faith, and fear, allowing the plantation order to continue as if nothing had ever been wrong. Before we talk about individual consequences, it's important to understand a broader pattern that existed across the South. When something threatened the plantation order, the response was rarely written down. Punishment did not need records. Disappearance did not need explanation. Silence was the system's preferred solution. Enslaved people who were seen as problems often vanished from the historical record without ceremony. A name might appear once in a ledger, then never again. No reason given. No note of death. No transfer explained. To the system, their absence required no justification. Punishment was often informal and absolute. It could mean being sold suddenly to a distant plantation. It could mean forced labor under harsher conditions. It could mean confinement, violence, or death that went unrecorded. These acts were carried out privately, away from scrutiny. Plantation records were designed to protect owners, not preserve truth. They tracked productivity, not pain. Births were sometimes listed as numbers, not names. Deaths were ignored if they disrupted profit or raised questions. Human lives were reduced to margins. When scandal threatened power, erasure became a tool. Removing a person removed the problem. Without witnesses, stories faded. Without records, truth lost its footing. This was not accidental, it was intentional design. Abrupt endings in archives are common. A person appears in census lists, then disappears without explanation. Historians see these gaps repeatedly. They are not mysteries of chance. They are evidence of control. Enslaved voices were rarely allowed permanence. They were spoken over, written out, or never recorded at all. Letters were forbidden. Testimony was dismissed. Memory survived only through oral tradition, often fractured by trauma and separation. Even when enslaved people survived punishment, their stories were stripped of legitimacy. Courts did not recognize their words. Churches rarely challenged their suffering. Newspapers ignored their existence, unless it served white interests. What survives in history is filtered. Power decides what is remembered. Silence becomes proof only if you know how to read it. Absence speaks loudly when you understand why it exists. This is why so many records feel incomplete. It's not because nothing happened. It's because what happened was inconvenient. Truth did not serve the system. Erasure did. Understanding this pattern changes how we read history. We stop asking why stories ended. We start asking who benefited from that ending. And in doing so, we begin to hear the voices that were never meant to be heard at all. Before we talk about the sources themselves, it's important to understand how history was recorded on plantations. Birth records, church entries, and plantation logs were not neutral documents. They reflected priorities, property, labor, and reputation. Human life, especially the lives of the enslaved, was filtered through those lenses. Birth records existed, but often incompletely. A child born to an enslaved woman might be noted only as an addition to labor numbers, not as an individual. Dates could be vague, names altered, or entirely omitted, if the event threatened social order. Twin births, scandalous unions, or any birth that challenged hierarchy were particularly prone to being hidden or ignored. Church entries might offer a faint trace of events, but even these were selective. Baptisms could be recorded, but only in ways that preserved moral appearances. Clergy often acted as agents of the social system, documenting events in ways that reinforced obedience and virtue rather than truth. Miraculous or controversial events could be framed as divine intervention, deflecting attention from human actions that were socially or legally unacceptable. Plantation logs were the most practical records, tracking labor, crop output and property transfers. They rarely included personal details that could disrupt the narrative of order and control. Pregnancies, births, and family connections among the enslaved were often noted only when they affected labor or inheritance. Anything that revealed scandal, abuse, or resistance was left unrecorded. Deliberate gaps in documentation were intentional. Silence was safer than explanation. A story that could question authority or morality had no place in official records. If a child's origin was controversial, if a relationship defied social norms, if a truth exposed the fragility of power, it was erased before it could appear on paper. The absence of records was itself a tool of control. Over time, these silences became part of the historical narrative. What was not recorded was gradually treated as if it never existed. Scholars piecing together events encounter gaps, inconsistencies, and missing names, but those gaps are themselves meaningful. They point to what power wanted hidden and what it considered dangerous to acknowledge. Silence in this context becomes history. The absence of documentation does not mean the absence of events, it means events were inconvenient. They threatened authority, morality, or property. They were erased, reframed, or rendered invisible. What remains is shaped as much by omission as by inclusion. Reading these records critically requires understanding the system behind them. Numbers, dates, and entries are never neutral. They carry intent. The missing names, the absent stories, and the unexplained events reveal the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable to remember. In those gaps, the untold histories of enslaved people, their families, and the controversies of plantations quietly persist, waiting to be recognized. In examining these hidden histories, we begin to understand how the past continues to shape modern society. The truths that were buried, the voices that were silenced, and the events that were erased remind us that history is often written by those in power. Confronting these uncomfortable realities is not just about acknowledging the past, it's about learning from it, recognizing the resilience of those whose stories were hidden, and ensuring that truth is never so easily silenced again. If you found this exploration eye-opening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories that history tried to hide.